So our last session is going to be a broad and sort of big discussion. I mean, look how many chairs we've got up here. You know big things are going to happen when you put that many chairs on the stage. So we're going to look at synergies, and we're going to look at integration and the interplay between the two. And we're going to look at it both from the expectation of a chairman of a board, of a CEO, as well as the poor folks that are on the hook to integrate and make these deals happen. But once again, we're going to lean on the rigor of research that BCG has done. And Nitin's going to first start here with a few slides, and then we're going to bring up the panel from there. So Nitin, come on over and take it away. Here's your driver.
Am I on? Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. We have a great panel with us today. But I think before we get into the panel, I just want to take a couple minutes to talk about BCG's research on synergy and post-merger integration. So I'm a principal at BCG. In particular, I work with the BCG Transaction Center, which is a dedicated group that focuses on helping our clients succeed with corporate transactions. And so with respect to M&A, that may mean helping companies determine what their M&A strategy is. It could mean helping them screen and kind of determine who's the best target and diligence that target. It can go helping them with negotiation and deal execution support alongside their investment bankers and their lawyers. And then finally, post-closing, helping them integrate that target and achieve those synergies that they promised to the market when they announced the deal. On top of that, we also advise on or help our clients with divestitures, figuring out maybe if something in their portfolio may no longer make sense with their corporate strategy, IPOs, and joint ventures. So as we talked about, I think, as we all know, most M&A deals don't or fail to realize their value. And in terms of BCG's research, we found that it's about 64% of deals don't create shareholder value. There's plenty of empirical and academic research that kind of supports that conclusion. It's also a risky proposition for your shareholders. I think it's hard to predict how the market is going to react to your deal. I think what's easy to predict is that the market is going to have a view and that your stock price is going to move when your deal gets announced. And so this is just a graph showing how stock prices have moved in the 20-day window following a deal announcement. And there's a lot more volatility in your stock price after your deal announcement than there was before. And so that makes it a risky proposition for your shareholders and for your executives and board members. And in our discussions with corporate leaders, we have found that it falls into three kind of buckets of reasons why deals aren't successful. The first is the execution, the kind of pre-closing area of the deals. Second is post-merger integration. And then third is just bad timing. And if you look at the execution, the deal execution, more times than not, corporate leaders find that they actually did that right. They found the right target. They don't think they overpaid. And they thought the whole process of the deal was okay. Where corporate leaders feel that they aren't as successful is with the post-merger integration. And either the integration did not go as well as they planned, the deal was more complex than they anticipated, synergies, they failed to realize the synergies that they had estimated, or the deal just wasn't the right cultural fit. And I think that goes to show that really focusing on post-merger integration is key to having a successful transaction. So what leads to successful M&A? In our research, we kind of found that you have to excel on three disciplines: valuation, diligence, and integration. And so successful acquirers kind of balance the premium they pay for a deal with the synergies they expect to realize. And if you look at a metric, kind of the PE of synergies, so take the premium that you paid and divide it by the synergies you announce, you find that successful acquirers pay less than average for those synergies that they hope to realize. And in fact, if they're in the lower quadrant, the 0 to 25 percentile of paying a premium for synergies, they're actually even more successful. Successful acquirers have confidence in their diligence. They did the diligence, and they're able to announce synergy numbers when the deal is announced. Surprisingly, only 60% of M&A deals have a synergy number announced at the deal when the deal is announced. But those who announce overperform those who don't. And then finally, in the integration process, being transparent to your shareholders helps you overperform. There was a panelist earlier this morning who mentioned that you have to earn the right with your shareholders to do M&A. And so part of that is following up. And acquirers who follow up with their synergy numbers in earnings calls following the acquisition tend to overperform those who don't. This slide kind of shows the same numbers, but shows it graphically, showing that acquirers who excel in these three disciplines create shareholder value. And it's not that those acquirers who don't excel are creating less shareholder value. They're actually destroying shareholder value because the graphs, those bars are negative. The other thing we have found is that acquirers tend to be more ambitious internally than they announce to the street. So we have found that many companies, and including some of the companies, the panelists we're going to talk to today, have internal targets for synergies that are higher than what they announce. And having those internal targets actually helps them outperform because they're driven to kind of achieve that higher internal target that they have established. What we've also found is that companies that work with a strategic advisor, whether it be BCG or another consulting firm, tend to overperform and outperform even those ambitious targets. And so there is a science to post-merger integration. And so it helps to learn those best practices and implement those when you're in that process of closing your deal and integrating it with your company. And then finally, I know we want to bring the panelists on, but BCG has kind of determined these 12 imperatives for success in post-merger integration that kind of fall into these three buckets: set the direction, capture the value, and build the organization. And I think with these kind of three buckets is kind of the lens I want to speak to our panelists today. And so I want to bring them up and let's talk to them about their experience with PMI.
Hello, everyone. My name is Natalia Carvajal, and I am the head of the M&A Integration IM team at Microsoft.
My name is Richie DiFranco. Like I mentioned before, I am the integration lead for Oath, which is the AOL Yahoo parent subsidiary of Verizon.
Mayerlin Kanterman, Vice President of BYN Mellon and for the Global Corporate Development Group.
Peter Granat, CEO for SAI Global, based out of Sydney, Australia.
So I guess my first question for the panel is, when I did this presentation, I looked at this from financial metrics of measuring synergies. But I know that's not how every company looks at acquisition and determines its success. So how do you guys, kind of maybe going down the row, how do you guys measure acquisition success? And if it's not by financial metrics, what non-financial metrics do you use?
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, synergy is actually not one of the things that we look at when we're looking at acquisitions. We do acquisitions for three primary reasons. The first one is we want to acquire great talent or great IP. The other one is expand geographically. And then the last one is new offerings for customers that we already have in place. And so what we look at is, how can we really make sure that we capture that value? So some of the things we look at is we have a very, very robust scorecarding process, but it actually starts prior to we get to integration. So we look at the strategies. First thing, most important thing is the strategy. Why are we acquiring this company? What is the gap that they're really filling in? And so we work very closely with the engineering teams, which basically they're the ones who drive acquisition at Microsoft. It's based on the engineering teams. And then based on that direction that is kind of set through them, then we look at, okay, to achieve what you want to achieve, let's look at the right targets. So, to some of the points that were discussed earlier, it's what's the gap? What are the right targets for that gap? And then based on that, how are we going to really integrate the company? And so we don't have a one-size-fits-all standard for how we integrate companies. It really is very much deal dependent. So looking at what we want to get out of it, that's how we think, okay, let's look at our playbook. Our playbook has a lot of different flavors, and then let's figure out which one we're going to kind of really apply based on what we're looking at.
And it sounds like you have lower level employees engaged in that process as well, not just the corporate development office.
We do, and so it's actually, it's a village. So it definitely starts with the engineering team, and then the engineering leaders have to be extremely involved. But we also have people who are part of the engineering team, the day-to-day, that are telling us these are our pain points, or this is what this is what our customers are asking for. And so we kind of start there, and then we go from there to the biz dev team, from there to the corp dev team. And just a side note, corp dev and venture integration, which is my team, are two separate teams. But we're the ones in charge of due diligence because, again, we want to have more checks and balances to make sure that we're not a little too trigger happy, and that when we're looking at the companies, we're having the integration perspective of, well, I don't think this is going to work because our technologies are not necessarily similar enough, and the integration timeline is actually going to be longer than we expected. So if we have, we build a buy versus build case, and it may be that once we do the analysis of the technologies, it may be better to just build it in-house. So we're kind of looking at it from that lens as well.
Yeah, for us, I would say it's a bit of a struggle. We're kind of learning this as we go. We have a playbook at AOL, which is the company that I was at before we became Oath, but it was a 192-page playbook that some consultant firm created, and I think they're the only ones that know how to read it and use it. So it was like this retainer thing they were trying to do with us. So yeah, every acquisition or partnership that we do, we have a set of objectives. There's like 5 or 6 specific to the Yahoo deal. There were 6 objectives. The first one is usually around people. With the Yahoo deal, it was respectfully guide 16,000 people throughout this process. All of them will be impacted somehow, whether directly through some kind of synergy or some other kind of impact that they have from their day-to-day business. And then the other thing is, we have the deal model, which for Yahoo specifically was created a year and a half, 2 years ago, a long time ago. And so the people that sign up for that deal model, half of them are gone at the time that we're trying to realize the synergies. Mm-hmm. So if you think about what happened with us, the leadership team, Tim Armstrong's team, the ones that are executing on the synergies that are driving the value, half of those folks are different. Half of them did not sign up for any of the synergy targets, and so that's a bit of a renegotiation that has to happen with those folks. And so it's a challenge for us to kind of think through how we, in an industry that's moving so quickly, you have a deal model that's 4 to 5 years. How do you kind of stay focused on that to drive that deal value? It's something that I think we're doing pretty well with, but it's definitely a struggle for us.
Well, I would like to add that, in addition to capabilities or perhaps the strategic rationale, take a step back and looking at the lines of business itself, find out where they are in the cycle, in the sort of the Boston company metrics, like is it a cash cow, is it a growth company, or is it just a dog, and you just should be looking at divesting that. So I think it's important to just not adding capabilities to a dog, but looking back and say which line of business is worth to invest in. So if I have $100 and that's all I have, where is best allocated to?
And so my background's a little bit different. I'm running mid-market private equity-backed software businesses, and so now SAI Global, previously the Chicago company called Cision that GTCR backed, and obviously there when I was looking at in each of these deals at Cision we did 5 acquisitions in about 2 years. The last one was PR Newswire. It was really putting together a differentiated strategy, so it goes back to strategy. But obviously, just the way that we put the deal structures together, we were funding it off of synergies as we put those together. So we would look for certain types of companies that would fit into that. It wouldn't be the necessarily sexy software business that would have a very high multiple on revenue that would fit into our model. It had to be something that was very accretive on day one. And so we would put that together as part of the strategy. Geographic expansion also would fit into strategy as well, and then capabilities. And so it's really those combinations with my team, we would put that together. SAI also grew through acquisition. It was a public company up until December and is backed by a mid-market PE firm out of Asia. But that grew through about 40 acquisitions since 2003. So here I'm walking in, I'm new as of about 2 months ago, but I've inherited all these acquisitions, and trying to then put a lens on top of that to figure out a growth strategy, which we put in place as part of the thesis. And so part of that will be the dogs, part of that will be doubling down in a couple areas, mainly in risk and compliance software space is what we're working on. But it's a little bit of a Rubik's Cube on the strategy piece, the people piece, but most importantly in the mid-market space and how we're funding it is really the financial metrics to make the deal work.
So Peter, on one level, you want to have senior management involved in setting the integration strategy. At the same time, you don't want the merger integration to distract you from running the company you already have. How do you balance those challenges?
It is typically we'll bring in both. I've used both third-party teams and advisory services. I've also brought in individual consultants to run an integration office. We have a framework that we've used that I've used, but a lot of times we'll have to have people wear double hats in certain functional areas, mainly in finance, in HR. Those are the first ones that are basically doing two jobs for a while. And I think there's, as you look at the talent across both groups on the integration side, there are opportunities to leverage from both sides and create some additional bandwidth. But it does stretch teams. I think most people in the room have probably been in these situations. It really stretches teams very hard, trying to juggle that balance.
Yeah. And what's the level of senior involvement in kind of your larger organizations when you're setting up an integration or planning for it, setting the direction?
Well, in our case, I would say they're highly involved. Depending on the size of the acquisition. Our acquisitions go through an internal approval process. Goes through, first of all, finding a business owner that do they really want it and do they want to take on this effort? Is this a big distraction to their existing business? What are the resources that they have for a level of integration that this will take? That's kind of the conversations that we will have. Also, there's a operating committee member that will have to sponsor this, and it goes to the executive committee members. Make sure the CEO and the CFOs are blessing into these new acquisitions. And first of all, start with strategic. Do we have enough resources? Do we have a plan for integration? How is that going to look like? How long is this integration is going to take? We're talking about 3 years. Somebody might not sign up for this. So it's what's the process? So it's really, really highly involved.
And
Yeah.
Richie, you've set up an integration management office for your current deal.
That's right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So our executives are definitely bought in. They're the ones that sign off on the deal, and then they're the executive sponsor of the deal. The integration management office that we have, I feel like it's kind of a roller coaster, right? It's like this ebb and flow of folks that we pull into the business as we need them, and then now after the deal closes, they kind of get dissolved back into the business and start focusing on their specific lines of business. For the Yahoo deal specifically, my team, we had a pretty large group of consultants that we brought in, was about 40 or so people. Now it's down to one person. And so part of that is good, part of that is frightening. Right? I've lost a bit of control over what's happening here, and there's a very large acquisition and merger that's happening. But there's a fair amount of trust now that this is so big, right, that the business has to assume the responsibility and the accountability of making this thing work. You can't have an IMO that continues to drive this from a small back office. It needs to be fully integrated into each of the teams. And so I think from that perspective, it's a really good thing. So yeah, depending on the size of the deal, we'll pull in people as kind of a special project. You very quickly learn a great scope of the business, and then you go back in and kind of choose where you want to continue to add value. So I think, from an employee experience, I think that's a pretty cool place to be.
Okay. Thinking of Microsoft buying LinkedIn, thinking of Verizon buying AOL, those are kind of businesses that I believe the headline was, well, we're going to leave the company standalone. What does that mean in terms of integration?
So it's a really good question because it took us a while to figure out what that was going to mean. And I think, we have a playbook which we use for how to integrate companies very thoroughly. Uh-huh. We didn't really have a playbook of, well, how do we really leave it standalone and what does it mean from a compliance perspective and a governance perspective? You can't, now, even though they say they're separate companies and they each have their own email address and they're fairly independent, from a governance and a tax perspective, Microsoft owns LinkedIn. And so we have to report it. And it was a very tricky integration of certain systems on the back end. And then there's a discussion that you have with the CEO of LinkedIn, which is Satya, our CEO, told you you're going to be fully independent. Well, guess what? That actually doesn't mean that you're fully independent. That means that we have to integrate these 5 things. And then he's telling you, no. I have an email from Satya saying I'm independent. And so there's a lot of back and forth with those, and legal and tax have to get heavily involved. And so it's been a few months, and I feel like we're finally getting to a point where we kind of have a clear picture of what that means. But I mean, the transaction closed back in November, and we're still figuring out what does it really mean for them to be independent, and then what does the future hold. Most integrations where you leave them standalone, yeah, maybe the brand will be standalone, and maybe there's a few factors that kind of remain independent, but it doesn't mean that you want to have 2 separate back offices. You want them to take advantage of a lot of the capabilities that you have, especially Microsoft, which is extremely large. So it's been a pretty interesting juggling.
Right. Does it create cultural challenges of certain groups, like, well, why do they get to do something this way, kind of even your existing businesses?
It does, and not specifically for LinkedIn, but there's been a few other what we call hybrid cases where we, for example, have a gaming company where it's a startup-y company and they really want to keep that culture because it's young and hip and cool, and Microsoft is nothing like that. And so we have different bonus structures for them. And so people at Microsoft are like, wait, you're giving these guys a much bigger bonus than you're giving us. Why is that? And so you have those discussions and you say, well, yeah, but you have all these benefits that they don't, and it's tricky. So you have to kind of keep a little bit of a cover to what those differences are. And then another complexity is, well, somebody works for that company. They're technically part of Microsoft. They want to apply to a Microsoft job, and they can't. And so it's how do you, from an HR perspective, manage all of that? So those hybrid cases and those standalone cases, they sound great on paper. They're great for the company that you're leaving standalone. They're a nightmare for the integration office.
Richie or Mayerlin, have you experienced that? Because you both work for companies that are very historic, very old, at the same time both getting into tech, whether it be ad tech or it be fintech.
Well, we have experience. I mean, if you look at BYN Mellon, there is the investment management side, which is like a multi-boutique approach. So they're sort of the standalone boutiques that have their own names. They have their own strategy as to like what kind of funds they will target. They have sort of similar clientele or not, but they kind of function as a hey, I'm Neetan, a subsidiary of BYN Mellon. So they, from the branding perspective, there's advantages to that. I personally not a big fan of acquisitions for standalone just purpose, because there's a lot of you don't fully integrate them. You're not part of the parent. They're kind of like, we don't want to be part. There's a lot of complexities, as Natalia described before. That even from the system perspective, now you have to, hey, by the way, your P&L have the allocations for finance, for accounting, for payroll systems, whatever. And so they just load it with additional expenses in their P&L. So I mean, like, standalone for the brand name, I just never know how much value there is for just leaving them alone versus the just integrate them completely. So maybe Peter has.
I've done a bunch of branding tricks on. You sometimes do that to retain the customers. So there's commercial reasons for doing that, but obviously on the back office and system standpoint, a lot of that doesn't make sense, and so it's finding that right line of how do you do that to keep it commercially focused on the customer and not distract that at the same time while you're trying to actually be able to make payroll and report your numbers. So there's a balance there.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that our goal is always to integrate, but unfortunately things feel like standalone after a while. That's how we ended up with 10 or 15 Salesforce instances at AOL. It's like you kind of lose your focus, and as you go, it's like, oh, the next deal, and the next deal, and you kind of forget about all the work that still has to happen. Now that this Yahoo deal closed, we're trying to unravel a lot of that stuff, and hopefully we can stay focused over the next year or so and really kind of clean up a lot of that stuff that's happened in the past. I know on the Yahoo side, their Tumblr acquisition was standalone, and so now we're trying to figure out what happens with Tumblr moving forward if they continue to stand alone. They have a very unique voice and a very unique product, so maybe that does work. But I agree that it's kind of the 80-20. These small little things that are standalone are the bulk of the work in the reporting and all of that stuff that needs to happen.
Yeah, he just brought up a really good point, and I think that's prevalent in the financial services. You look at a lot of legacy platforms that are not fully integrated, and even like to pull up one report, you have to go to 10 different website technology. So it's just a big problem at the end.
Oh yeah, it's just this kind of weight on the business, and it's driving inefficiencies, and you can kind of see the money kind of flowing out. And you're a seller on the street talking to a customer, and you don't have reporting in your back pocket. That's a problem.
And does that hinder you from reaching out to customers of maybe one business, cross-selling with something from your existing business?
Sure. I mean,
And a follow-up to that question is, how do you communicate integration to your customers, and how do you involve them in that process?
yeah, I think, Peter, the point that you were making of hopefully we can kind of, behind the curtain, it can be a mess, but in front of the curtain, it's like, no, everything's great. Everything's fully integrated. Don't worry about it. We'll send you that one invoice for the 14 companies that are behind here. So, I mean, that's kind of the art and the science that needs to happen. So, yeah, it's certainly a challenge. Patching together reporting, whether it be financial or audience or whatever kind of reporting that you have across the business, is incredibly challenging when you have so many back-end systems that you have to patch together. Definitions of things, like, sometimes just the metrics themselves are coming over in different ways, and so putting that together is certainly a challenge.
Yeah. Peter, since you are the CEO of companies and you work with PE firms, how do you manage the communication of synergy targets with your investors, whether it be at the beginning of a deal or through the life cycle of the integration and towards the end when you've said, okay, we're done with the integration, have we achieved the synergies we promised?
Each firm is a little bit different. The firms I've worked with tend to be very hands-on pre-deal. We'll typically work together in a deal team with advisors. I will set up a separate deal team out of the functional areas in the business, and by functional area, they'll go in and do due diligence. And there's a little bit of back and forth, obviously, that always happens on synergy setting and targets. And then typically, in a mid-market company, it'll come from the corp dev team, but it comes directly to me and the CFO, and we just sit down and before we go back to the board with what we're going to put forth as a synergy target. There's a lot of discussion back and forth, and how aggressive can we be to really support it and push the price, because most everything is going to auction, especially in our space. And so you really, in the niches that I've operated in, it's pushed prices up pretty high over the last couple of years. So there's a lot of pressure on getting that right, but also being aggressive at the same time, and then holding teams accountable. So that's kind of pre-deal. After it happens, the way we set up the integration office, hopefully half the team's not gone. That does create an issue, and there, I've inherited situations like that as well, where you walk into something that's you're just climbing uphill from the very beginning. But typically, I've organized very small teams because it's mostly been market. So corp dev will sit in the integration office as well, and if they put forth certain targets, they're on the other side having to actually do some of the work and figure out how to put the pieces together. And then it just varies by functional area. Some we can move faster on, and others it's really a combined function with the acquisition target.
And then with the larger companies, have any of you been asked to check in or provide information that kind of makes its way to earnings calls?
Yes, and we actually do. So we have a very robust scorecard process for that. And we always have like the key value drivers, right? And so like very early on we figure out what those are, and then based on that we kind of develop like the scorecard where we have people metrics on the top, and then we have kind of integration metrics on the engineering side, but then really the big one for us is the business metrics, and that is kind of the reason for the acquisition. So like, do we want monthly active users to go up, or is it daily active users, or like seats or downloads, or whatever that may be, or monetization? And that is a piece where we call that the North Star metric. And based on that, like everything else can be green. If the North Star metric is red, then the whole deal is red. And those things, I mean, that is reviewed with the CFO on a quarterly basis, and that's what we use for the earn-out call.
So before the earnings call, the CFO or the CEO gets a little briefing on how the integration is going, so that if a research analyst asks that question, he or she knows how to answer it.
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
We'll sit down with them on a quarterly basis. We'll review it for about an hour and a half.
Okay.
We'll go deal by deal. Obviously, the bigger deals are the ones that are going to be called upon. So like, LinkedIn gets called on every time. The smaller ones nobody really cares about, but they'll have it if an analyst asks in general about acquisitions and how they're going, they'll be able to give an answer.
Okay. And I want to shift from kind of synergies to people. Integration is not just about the technology, but it's also about integrating teams, people into your business. Richie, Yahoo was for sale for years, or considering a restructuring for years. It was a long period between signing and closing with a lot of ups and downs.
Yep.
How did your team at AOL keep Yahoo employees motivated and retained?
Yeah. I think it was an incredible learning process throughout that time. If I think about that first objective of guiding 16,000 people throughout this process, we really focused on that the whole time. Everybody was impacted. You either potentially lost your job, you lost your network, you lost you're now aligning to a different strategy that you may not be bought into. You're working from a different office. There's some kind of impact. And so I would say, the way that I think about my job sometimes is, 50% of the time I'm a project manager on a really gnarly, cool project, and then 50% of the time I'm a therapist to the employees that are like going through this. And sometimes they just want to be heard. Sometimes they just want to vent a bit. I think that transparency and honesty throughout the process is very helpful. I think making sure that the value that the CEO is communicating is the same value that your manager is also communicating to you, so that you're hitting it at multiple levels and it starts to make sense to me as an employee. So yeah, I think those are the key things. And then there are some folks that are just unhappy with the deal, right? I mean, and so you kind of have to have those one-off conversations. We just had an employee sentiment survey that went out a couple weeks ago asking how the integration was. And this one person replied with, the integration is a disaster. You took away the guacamole from the salad bar. And so like, that person is just unhappy throughout the process. Whether it's the guacamole or not, like, we need to talk to that person and see what's going on, get them remotivated. Let's see if, let's maybe change up their job. What's really at the root of the guacamole comment, and see if we can kind of help that. And there's going to be some of those people that just don't want to be part of the company anymore. You can also have that very honest and kind of transfer conversation. But yeah, that was top of mind throughout my entire process, because Yahoo's had kind of entered this process already in a place that they had been on the auction block for a long time. And then closing, I started this process 14 months ago. There were 3 or 4 closing dates throughout that time that we thought the deal was going to close. 3 months from now, 5 months from now, 2 months from now, a year from now. Like, it kept on moving. And that was difficult from a motivation perspective. But I think honesty and transparency is really the key.
I had a similar story on an acquisition we did, and it was another tech software business we acquired, a competitor, and they had a candy store in the office, and I decided to replace that with fruit.
Bad idea.
I was the CEO that took away their candy, and it got all over Glassdoor. Candy came back. But it's the little things that matter.
For sure.
I mean,
And Natalia, I'm sure you see that when you buy a 10-person company that has a game room and beer night, and Welcome to Microsoft.
It's really tough. I mean, and one of the things that we're trying to do to kind of make it a little bit easier on them is our offices are becoming cooler, which is kind of nice for everybody. But also, like, believe it or not, like assigning an admin who is trained on our systems and processes. You don't think about that, but like most of the complaints we get after we do the survey is change management was a disaster. I have to open a PO and it took me 5 weeks. And it's true, if you think about it, when you're a startup, you need a new service. What do? You go online, you put your credit card in, and then kaboom, it's done. Now you join Microsoft, and it's like, oh no, that's not one of our vendors, so you have to go to this approval process. It's going to take 5 weeks. That's not going to fly. And so one of the things we've done is that, and we also do, I mean, we do a lot in terms of people. So we assign them a buddy. We also do kind of roundtables for companies that were acquired and are kind of in the same age range. So we look at that, like similar technologies. And so we're always constantly thinking about that. And for me, I'm extra sensitive because at one point in time, I started a company and I was acquired, ironically enough. And so I've lived through it and I know how painful it can be. And so every time we're going through an acquisition, I'm putting myself in that person's shoes. Okay. And so one of the things we do is make sure that the leadership on our team is extremely involved with the leaders on that company and that they're constantly communicating the next steps, what's going to hurt, what's going to be better, so that they're kind of going into it with eyes wide open.
Any other tricks on how to keep employees motivated?
You know what? I mean, in the financial services, like big corporations, they're very like dressy. So now you're like getting into like the fintech, and they're dressed down. Even as simple as that, as like understanding their culture, what is it that they like. You know, the motivations are different, right? And being aware that, hey, by the way, you know, we are big company. There's some bureaucracy even to get a vendor assigned. What is it like they will be looking for, and kind of understanding that, you know, you need to manage that process separately and making sure that the employees that you're acquiring understand, you know, what the new culture is, but you also kind of, you know, get in their shoes, right, to understand what they're looking for. And partially it could be that level of independence. So as much as you can provide it, that's a good to go.
So it almost sounds like you need to diligence the customer or the cultural fit as
That's
part
right.
of your diligence efforts, and
That's
think
right.
about and communicate with at least the senior leadership of that target before you buy it on what cultural changes may be required, what can we accommodate, what can you accommodate.
Yeah, also on that point, one of the things that we've done now is we have this program called the Navigators Program, which are kind of the change agents. There's 300 folks that are all across the company that are not only a tool for us to kind of bounce ideas off of before we roll them out to the entire company, like we're going to change the identity system, or we're going to consolidate these two systems into one, let's bounce it off the navigators first, but also to prepare those folks, because they're the admins, they're the ones that people go to in the offices when like my computer's not working, or I forgot my password, I don't know what to do. So they're a really empowered group of folks with budget to make things happen. It's been very successful.
And I'd say two more things to add to the people front, because I honestly feel like most acquisitions fail due to so I think this is the most important thing. One is look beyond the acquisition. So you're acquiring a group of people. Think, you know, if it's a technology acquisition or a people acquisition, what's the next role for that person? How do you keep them engaged beyond the 2 years that you have kind of your earn out or something along those lines? And can you give them a role in the company that is going to keep them thinking as entrepreneurs? Because if you think about it, a lot of these smaller companies are entrepreneurial. They want to develop things. So like, how do you do that? So that's definitely one. And then the other one is kind of, I totally lost my train of thought. Fabulous.
Well, if I can add,
There goes one.
It's as simple as communication. You know, like if you don't have a good communication plan, the day you're closing or the deal is announced, I mean, like employees are gonna wonder, oh, am I gonna lose the job? I mean, what is going to
And that was
happen
actually my
with
next
me,
question.
right?
So yeah, that
So-
communication is very important.
Yeah.
I'd like to actually open it up to questions and see if anyone in the audience has any questions on integration or synergies.
This is for Natalia. So when you mentioned your updates, your periodic updates to the leadership on the integration, how do you get alignment with the management team that owns that business, how they're doing, and how you're going to expose how they're doing if they're on track, off track?
Yeah, so we actually have, can I repeat the question? So the question is, when we're doing the monthly report, the quarterly report outs, how do we get aligned with the management team of the acquired company, the target company? And so it's a really good question because, if everything's green, then there's no issues, right? But it's when you get into the time where things are not quite going as expected, the way in which we do it is we actually get information individually from all of the different functional leads, from the engineering team, and then from the acquired company. And so we're kind of getting a number of different data points, and the management company is the last one that we meet with, so that if there's concerns and things don't quite add up, we can say, hey, this is what we've heard, and this is why. Tell us your side of the story. So there's that communication, and they can also tell us, well, I don't agree with what they're saying, and this is why. And so it's an open dialogue. But we also have the integration managers giving their perspective, because they're kind of tied into every single one of those stakeholders. And so we kind of see the integration managers as really being like the truth bearers of yeah, things are not going quite that well, but this is why it really shouldn't be red, or this is why it should be. And so it's a long lead time. It takes us about a month to get all of the information ready so that everybody's kind of comfortable. And truth be told, sometimes we'll say things are red, and then we present it to Satya and Amy, our CFO, and they'll say, no, you know what? Even though we're not on target for technology, from a strategy perspective, we think it's green, and then it's green. So there's a lot of...
That's all you have to do.
Yeah.
Any other questions in the audience?
Then-
Right here.
My question is, in the process of doing the transaction, how do you as an integration entity make sure that where the primary focus in due diligence is getting risk information, but you're wanting information that's more forward planning? And I know from going through the process, many times there's a rub, right? Because the transaction team wants to move quickly. They don't want what's perceived as kind of frivolous questions to get on and close the transaction, where integration also has a job to do. So how do you manage that dichotomy? And then also, I wanted to ask about lessons learned. So how do you, once you get into integration and you learn things, how do you filter that back through the deal team so that you expand your playbook, or you are more efficient about kind of how you're dissecting the company and picking up integration type issues?
So if I could just summarize the question, I think the first question is, in the diligence process, how do you balance the fact-finding objective of diligence with the planning for the integration process? And your second question is, how do you take the feedback and the lessons learned and roll that back into your merger playbook so that before you start the process of the next deal, you have those lessons learned and have incorporated them?
I can respond from, I'm more in the execution side, but I do ask the business to put an implementation plan, a conversion plan, at least at a high level. What is this going to look like for several reasons? Resources. Another reason is how am I going to manage the TSA? If there's a TSA, how much support do we need from the other side? And for how long? So I think and for us, it's very important to know what will be the cost of integration and what is part of that cost, what is one-time cost, what is some of it that can be capitalized. So we get into the really nitty-gritty as to finding out what the true cost is in the model. And we also get all the internal partners that we need, whether it's real estate, whether it's tax, whether, it's a bunch of people who can put together this, not only giving me the information, just to get a sense of what the numbers look like, but also what it's gonna look like afterwards. And in terms of like lesson learned, there's a comparison between what we forecast and the actuals for everything that we do. So, it's just inherited. We're gonna get that information.
I can pipe in too. So for your first question, Microsoft have worked at a number of companies doing integration. Microsoft is the first one where due diligence is actually managed by the integration team and not the corp dev team. So that kind of gives us a little bit of the extra perspective where we can actually go in and look at due diligence with the integration lens as well. So we're obviously looking out for the deal side, but we're also thinking ahead of what could be an integration risk. And so we're kind of going in from that perspective, which kind of makes it a little bit easier to develop our integration plans. And if there's issues, then we kind of bring them up ahead of time. And there's been deals that have been killed by us because we think that there's an integration risk. So that's kind of a nice, very different way of doing things. And then on the lessons learned side, we actually do, so we do the postmortem after every acquisition, and then we create, on a quarterly basis, we create ICE teams. We call them ICE teams. And it's teams that are, if we see that there's recurring themes that are coming up in a lot of the postmortems, we actually assign them to a team that is a cross-functional team to go resolve, why is this happening constantly? And they're tasked with, the duration will vary depending on what the issue is, but it can be anywhere from 6 months to a year where they actually go do a deep dive as to why is this happening and how do we fix it. So it's kind of closing the loop.
So we have about a couple minutes left, but I just want to have everyone just go down the row and say, what tips do you have for a company that is either looking to do more M&A or has just signed its first deal and is looking to integrate do its first integration?
If you're looking to do the first integration, I would definitely say, get external help because they've done it a number of times. They'll have a number of best practices that are going to help. If you're a robust, a company that's been around the block and done them, then you're okay. And even then, you still, for larger deals, will bring external counsel. So.
Yeah, I would say have the integration teams involved as early as possible in the deal process, well before close, please. But we have a blueprint process at Oath where all of the teams that are involved, whether that be just the back office, the real estate HR, or the front office teams, they create a blueprint integration strategy also as early as possible, and that continues to evolve throughout the process, which that has proven to be very helpful for us.
Richie, just to follow up, have you ever had antitrust concerns or kind of working with a competitor, like if you're buying one, that has kind of prevented you from getting that integration team in before closing? So
the integration team that I'm talking about would be just on the AOL side, would be just on the Oath side. It's not in collaboration with the target. We're not doing any of that kind of gun jumping or any of that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's on our side. But then, as quickly as possible, as soon as we can, we certainly get more info from the other side to help kind of validate some of those business plans.
Have you ever seen clean teams go in, like a third party go in? Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's part of the consultant's job this time was to serve as a clean team, to kind of do that work and kind of funnel as necessary information that could help drive integration plan.
And for those of you not familiar with the term, the clean team would be like a third-party consultant who can go in and do kind of diligence on the company or kind of gather information before the closing date. So that way, if the deal falls apart, that information doesn't go back to the acquirer, that they could use for competitive purposes.
Yeah, I can echo the same thing as my peers here. I think depending on the size of your company, you might not have an integration head or team. So just find out who will be responsible for that integration will be key. Whether it's like the business and maybe an assigned PMO, so getting them at the speed of what's going on. And also engage your internal partners to review not only from like the deal and sort of giving you the numbers now, but sort of like operationally, how is this gonna look like, right? Whether it's like if I'm negotiating to get paid, 10 business days, is that even accurate? Like when are my invoices getting here? I mean, like simple things like that I just don't know all the accounting rules or the, the finance team was the preference or, I mean, like it could be hell for them if I start agreeing on something that operationally they're not able to support. So having those people to kind of look at the deal ahead of time, I think is really helpful.
I would just add from getting the kind of the cultural fit right and the people at the leadership team right from both sides aligned as quickly as possible cuts down on a lot of the noise that cascades down throughout an organization. So, just when I'm looking at it, I'm trying to figure out very quickly how I'm going to bring two leadership teams together, who's going to sit where, and the sooner you can get through that piece, kind of the teams on both sides start to feel either more comfortable or less comfortable. And so speed is everything because the whole organization is just really unstable. You're not focused on the customer, you're focused internally, and just getting that behind you as quickly as possible. So I try and push that as fast as I can, and whether it's day 1 or day 30, it's as quick as possible.
And I guess the other takeaway is don't take away your target's employees' guacamole or candy.
Yeah.
Because that will cause some problems.